Good morning. We're going to give about 2 or 3 more minutes to let folks sign in, we appreciate your coming and joining on time. Just as a heads up to give you something to think about kind of while we're waiting, one of the things that we'll do at the end of this session is ask you for suggestions about who you might like to hear from in the future. And you can, of course, suggest anybody in government who uses analytics and has some information that might be of broad interest. But I actually want to kind of give you a little bit of food for thought to help you not only use this as a springboard for your own thoughts, but perhaps with a direct answer. One of the things that we're kind of thinking a little bit about in the background about government analytics is trying to figure out how some folks who use analytics get others to pay attention to the results. Because as we all know, sometimes people pay attention to evidence and data, and sometimes they don't. And we'd love to hear from some person in government who's had some real success going from a situation where there was poor use or poor attention paid to analytics and results to a place where the analytics carried real weight and really impacted decision making. So if you have a friend or a colleague or even someone that you just know the program but don't know anybody involved with it, where they really got good results and had people pay attention to and absorb and act on the analytics, we'd love to use that as the topic for a future presentation. The other option is just kind of another topic, which is, of course, with COVID, there's been a lot of information and data. It's occasionally hard to make sense of, and often there are disagreements about it. But it would be really interesting if someone said, hey, there's some fantastic predictive analytics work going on with COVID, because I know that there is. And we think that person X or Dr. Y would be a great person to come and talk about, predictive analytics with respect to COVID, to kind of make it timely and to give, again, some good ideas about how predictive analytics are structured and used that would be useful to this community as a whole. So I'll come back to those questions kind of at the end of our session. Hope you think a little bit about them between now and that time. And then in about a minute or so, Jennifer Bachner will kick things off for us and get started. Then I'll introduce our presenter today, Stephen Costello-Lowe. So in just about a minute, we'll get started. Thank you for joining.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to say good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for another virtual meeting of our Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. I'm Jennifer Bachner, and I direct the Data Analytics and Policy Program at Johns Hopkins University. We've hosted this forum for about 6 years now, and we're thrilled to have many regular attendees. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I want to provide just a little bit of context. We host this forum with REI Systems to bring together academics and professionals to cultivate a community in which we discuss how analytics can be used to address challenges in the public sector. Over the years, we've heard from many top leaders in government about how they're advancing their organization's mission using analytics. Today, we encourage you, as always, to ask questions, but today we'd like you to ask your questions after our speaker's presentation. You can either type out your question in the chat box or use the hand icon. I think there might be a questions box, actually. That would be good for typing out your questions. We also encourage you to tweet about the forum using the hashtag #GabForum, and we'll be posting a shareable video of the event afterward in case any of your colleagues are interested. Again, many thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us, and I will now turn the program over to my co-host, Jeff Myers at REI Systems, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thanks very much, Jen. Again, for those of you who are new, the purpose of this forum is really to create community. It's a little tougher, of course, with the virtual format, but we will be happy to share with you each other's contact information. And the purpose, again, is primarily to give you each a set of resources to be able to say, hey, I've reached a roadblock. I'm having trouble. I want to have help solve this problem, and to give you some folks to turn to. So you may ask questions directly of people here. Mr. Costello has kindly agreed to share his contact information. We'll send in a follow-up email along with his presentation after the next day or so. And certainly you're welcome to contact Dr. Bachner or myself. We can help you find resources amongst the rest of the community. There's a small possibility we may be able to answer your question ourselves, although I won't make any guarantees. Just a 20-second kind of introduction to REI for those of you who are not familiar with us. We focus on helping digitize government, and we're about making mission impact. We work primarily with the federal government, and we like to be able to measure the mission impact. We're particularly proud that recently, for example, we've been helping modernize the immigration system that the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services use, and it's resulted in almost 20% increases in productivity, and at the same time, improvements in quality, both in terms of a reduction of the cases that are appealed, as well as a reduction of cases of fraud. Similarly, and actually I think I'm even more proud, though I had nothing to do with the project, for the Office of Trafficking in Persons, which is part of HHS, we've made it possible with the same level of staffing for that office to serve 50% more victims of human trafficking, wage slavery, sexual slavery, and also for them to do it about twice as fast. So the purpose of our technology, frankly, is to make that impact, but the analytics are what help us understand whether or not the impact has been made, and to do some kind of agile trial and error to see, is this new technology really working or is it not? Do we need to try something different? And to be able to kind of make those iterative improvements in a way that is both understandable and acceptable. And what I actually am also pleased about with the Office of Trafficking in Persons is that ability to kind of make quick changes allowed it to be the case that HHS presented an original idea, and the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice said, no, that needs to be tweaked. And we were able to come back with some tweaks and make changes that allowed a number of government agencies to collaborate in ways they had found difficult to do before. But with all that as an aside, let me introduce our honored speaker, Stephen Costello-Lowe. He is the Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and as such is responsible for IT modernization strategy and planning. And frankly, he's the guy who helps try and lead the charge in terms of finding innovations and bringing the mission impact of digital technology to USDA. He also has previous experience working with the Office of Science and Technology Policy within the Office of Management Budget, so he has a great government-wide perspective in case you have questions or comments about things that go beyond the Department of Agriculture. He's got some particular expertise and experience with geospatial visualization, data analytics, crowdsourcing, and citizen science, and each of those I think are really current important topics. He's also one of the best educated folks that we've had. He's got a PhD from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He's got a degree in IT from the University of Virginia, a degree in public administration from Virginia Tech, and political science from James Madison. So he's really kind of ticked a wide range of boxes in terms of qualifications, and apparently is just never satisfied with the same university enough to go there twice. Each time, I guess, seeking kind of higher honors and higher expertise. So thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Costello-Lowe, and we look forward to your remarks. Once again, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in at any time. Mr. Costello-Lowe will answer them after he concludes his presentation in approximately 30 to 40 minutes. Stephen, it's all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning, and thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm not sure about the highly educated piece or overeducated, maybe. I think curiosity is an important aspect of who we are as professionals, and that curiosity leads us to the kinds of public solutions, but really public questions that result in solutions that we govern over time, policy, the administrative function of the organization. And what I'd like to do today is offer really an overview. We have a short period of time. I have way too many slides. They'll be provided to you later for further consideration, discussion. And I would like to have an ongoing discussion for those of you who are interested. But this is going to be relatively high level, and we're going to walk through these ideas sequentially. As we get to the question stage of this discussion today, at the end, we'll probably have 20 minutes more or less for Q&A. Please note the slide page number if your question emerges, and we can go back to that and look at it. So what I'd like to do is really set the front stage for this discussion. And I haven't worked in this format before. Maybe some of you have never participated in these events before. So let's give each other a little grace. We'll kind of, make our way through this together, and I'll look forward to your questions. First of all, I'd like to suggest that, pardon me, that we have a fundamental question here, and I'd like you to raise your hands on kind of where you land, either wanting to be right in your work in analytics or wanting to be happy. And I think this really is a fundamental question for leaders, because it results in how we set agendas, policy agendas, what we interpret to be the agenda, and then how we go about establishing that in our organizations. It also results in how we allocate resources and also the basis for ethical behavior and integrity. Do we want to be right or do we want to be happy? And I think this fundamentally gets to who we are as people and who we are as leaders. And this comes across in how we present ourselves, how we position ourselves, particularly in this kind of functional area of creating insights and developing inferences about the behavior, about the success of public policy. And so where do you land? I want to give you a perspective here that's really developed by Ian McGilchrist. He is a really wonderful thinker and has produced a book that has become extraordinarily popular. It's becoming more popular since its earlier publication, I think 2012, in which he looks at right brain, left brain. And, you know, we have some probably remembrance of Psychology 101, where we talked about right brain, left brain in our undergraduate years. He looks at this science more conclusively about right brain and left brain being really more complementary rather than in conflict. Yet the right brain piece, if you will, the intuitive piece, needs to come first when we start to set up different kinds of decision-making structures. And it's a more organic and symbolic kind of way of thinking about our world. And it's interesting in this quote, he's really presenting that if we get so wrapped around understanding the method, then sometimes it drives us into a premature early structuring of problems, which may not be the problem at all. It might be symptomatic of something larger. So how do we kind of attach the steering wheel to the race car here? And when we think about our current circumstances around wearing masks, for instance, this is an image of a medieval Black Plague doctor's mask. And the perception was that if you wore a mask and you filled it full of herbs, the aerosol preventative would keep you from getting the plague. Of course, if you're familiar, it was actually spread by fleas and stuff from rats, not such a good preventative, wearing a mask. So when we think about that, could ideology, for instance, be impacting our perceptions of these mass dictates that are coming out on a state basis? And what's to say about public policy implementation around the COVID protection? And some people are reacting strongly to masks. Well, maybe there's a history there, something that needs to be considered. When we start to normalize data analytics and the purpose of data analytics, primarily it lands in decision making. I mean, you're looking at analytics not as art, but as a tool for making better decisions. And we talked about McGilchrist. He's in the neuroscience sort of corridor here of this landscape of decision making. I think primarily the discussion that this organization, this community has been in the area of analytics and probably bleeding over into automation as well. But if we look across the landscape, there are multiple ways of thinking about analytics as a decision-making approach. And it depends on really your stakeholder, what you define as public good, and so forth. So not to get ourselves constrained by kind of one view, one perspective, but look at data analytics dimensionally as a decision-making approach. Well, you know, it's risky business. Decision-making has a variety of different outcomes. And we often try to control our decision-making apparatus to contain these kinds of attributes. The unknown consequences in particular, I think so often when we're introducing new ways of thinking about, for instance, equity in the policies that we develop, and then the programmatic ways of deploying that in practice, the unknown consequences can be really, really difficult for us to overcome in terms of that adoption cycle. So how do we look at risk and realize that it's going to be a challenge? It's always going to remain with us, but not over control for it, not over analyze the process of analytics to control for these factors. So I put together kind of my view of analytics meaning making, a step model. And these 5 kind of core ways of moving forward from start to finish are intended to kind of summarize, if you will, normalize the process. Small events, big questions, particular kinds of data, special methods, and insights. My observation is we are, as a community in the government, particularly, as well as our business partners, very good at identifying particular kinds of data. We are immersed in data. We have an excess of data available to us. We also have become more mature in our methods that we use to parse and categorize and classify that data in meaningful ways that produce certain kinds of insights, whether we're exploring a particular issue, trying to describe it or explain it, or establish some sort of repeatable patterns that we can understand and embed in algorithms. What we're not particularly accomplished at, in my opinion, is understanding the small events and the big questions that need to be asked about those small events to better position the data. And I think this is more on the subjective human side of looking at public policy and administration. What's important here is in those early elements, the small events and the big questions, we actually uncover second and third order effects. And that's huge in a very complex, ambiguous world. So if we are trying to get further down toward that early step movement of the model, the suggestion here is we have 2 different approaches for interpreting value. If fundamentally, innovation as a discovery, as a place of observation, as the really way of stepping back and observing particular small events and the emerging questions that come out as a way of elaborating what we're observing in public policy and administration. We have the more mature capabilities that bring us confidence on down selecting, reducing these particular data and special methods through analytics. And then what I'm suggesting is there's really a balanced approach. We simply need to look at ways we move upstream and understand the nature of the problem. These are not exclusionary. They are not in opposition or mutually exclusive in terms of their relationships. But we think about time maybe differently by looking at it this way. Well, why is this difficult? Well, it's partly difficult because we have competing worldviews. It's not that innovation and analytics are really competing against each other, but it's just that our worldviews quite frequently, and these are extremes, social construction, concrete structures, the basis of our reality is actually different. how we interpret reality in the world. And that leads to different ways of thinking and seeing and doing innovation and leading to analytics. So I won't go through these, but fundamentally, this gives us a sense of how subjective interpretations, objective interpretations, scientific view versus more an interpretive view can be in conflict. And it doesn't mean necessarily that innovation and analytics are in conflict, but simply that our worldviews can be. Also, an aspect of the challenge we have in front of us is you know, public service is quite convoluted sometimes. That it's composed of wicked problems, and wicked problems have certain attributes. Most often what we discover is the plans that we have executed in the past, when applied to new kinds of questions or policy initiatives and trying to execute against agendas and different performance metrics, those plans don't work particularly well. And we've hardened and created rigor within our systems that doesn't allow us to be agile and think creatively about how might we approach solutions differently in this particular context, in this particular piece of legislation or executive directives. Well, if we think about complements rather than competition, rational-analytic relative to intuitive heuristics have certain characteristics to them. Classically, in a policy analysis process, we go through a fairly stringent sequence to come to a set of alternatives from which to make a decision with. On the other hand, if we think about innovation as design, as an activity that we engage in deliberately, functionally, upstream, then we can begin to surface and discover maybe some of the essential elements of the problem set that we want to work with. And that produces certain kinds of patterns and new courses of action that actually fit well within an actual context, the context in which it belongs. So, given a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, it requires a deliberate design orientation. First, to sort out the noise and the inconsistency. If we slow down a bit before jumping into problem solving, technical rationality, and all the different tools we apply to that, and think about the puzzle pieces and the kind of rough edges, unfit edges that are present to us, it leads us to a place where design has an immediate purpose, and it has a very valuable contribution in this sort of decision-making process. Innovation as design actually increases the relevancy of our solutions, and to that particular solution, the analytics that we conduct, because it facilitates a conversation with the actual elements and attributes of a particular situation. Yet it allows the ambiguity and unknown consequences to reside, to remain, rather than trying to exclude those and create an experiment, a controlled experiment. Relative to that, it's a very local sort of way of thinking about policy and administration. It engages in a search process as well as kind of the formulation of the experiment, and it represents a solution in a way that is effective in its particular context. It's also improvisational in the sense that it addresses the action in a way that allows that action to occur over a series of episodes over time, rather than being constrained to kind of one frame, one kind of timestamp. It allows a series of episodes to be sort of stitched together, woven together in a way that we can see the more robust aspects of of the particular situation that we're trying to understand and observe. So I put together this framework, governance innovation framework, as a way of kind of collecting those capabilities that exist in our environment today. There's some really powerful tools, methods, really attitudes, frankly, that exist that we can put together in a way upstream to help us be more effective in our analytic reductionism downstream, and organize for effect. What this model tries to represent roughly is that we engage in cognitive work of thinking. We also are involved in observing and seeing and then doing particular kinds of policy, particular kinds of administrative activities. Well, how do we organize that in a way that tells us something substantive about what are the key assumptions about public value creation for the people who are experiencing it? That's design thinking. How do we validate those assumptions and so that they become operationalized for constituents, for different types of consumers, stakeholders, and systems thinking? And then where, when, and for whom is public value relevant? And that's the human-centered design piece that's really practice-based, looking at different kinds of assessments, interpretation, observations about the public policy and governance environment. So just to summarize what I'm calling replacement in the sense that we're putting innovation upstream rather than kind of thinking about it as an abstract, separate from, or even downstream from our analytics. Design thinking in place as a learning process. And what this helps us do is it starts with the meaning making from the human perspective, and it then positions downstream to finish stronger. And it attends to original meaning, it engages human agency, it has all the elements of interpretation, observation for sense making. It also is very powerful to enhance diversity and bringing in different perspectives that maybe had not been previously included in the planning, in the programming of our public policy, public administration solutions to create better value. And it emerges relevant questions, but it also does some helpful things with regard to just how we structure our conversations. We eliminate some of the rituals of culture and specialists, whether it's engineers, lawyers, policy wonks, economists, whoever. It reduces the noise that's created when we try to simplify prematurely too early. And then it also reconstructs power. And this is an important consideration where we're able to make space and give voice to folks on the margins. So to kind of sum up, the innovation process and how it contributes to data analytics is represented in this left to right sequence here. And we're establishing relevancy, engaging sense making, facilitating wayfinding. And this is really important. It isn't just about coming to some cogent, congruent understanding of the circumstances, but also facilitating kind of how we can move forward from that, and then promoting some persistence around the kind of institutional as well as the agent-based structures so that we can repeat what we've done in a way that is meaningful. And the what, the how, the why associated with each of these stages. And I won't go through them again because that would take a long time. I wanted to offer just some ideas here of how we can organize ourselves to optimize analytic value content. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different roles here. I think distinguishing these roles, if, for instance, if you're in a public organization, you might want to think about ways of organizing, factoring kind of your product assembly or the process you're trying to embed in the organization or bring forward the organization by considering specifically these kinds of roles and really calling out specifically what they do with regard to, content optimization. Now, I call it content versus data because I think content takes into account many of the different aspects of what leads to valuable data. If you think of content as metadata, if you think about it as kind of knowledge and behavioral aspects and use statistics around data itself, then you start to get an understanding of profile of content rather than simply bits and bytes. So I believe it comes down to a question of where we place our attention. Innovation and analytics are not in competition, but there's actually a lot of evidence for how how innovation can be upstream a contributor to downstream analytics refinement, and we have a lot of different tools to be able to accomplish that. And I have a literature reference for those of you who are interested. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Jeff and Ashley to facilitate any questions.
So please, those of you who have questions, type them into the question box. And if we notice and we're able to, we'll unmute you. You can just ask it orally. But to get things started, let me just ask the first question, Stephen. About 10 years ago, I did some research with a couple of colleagues that kind of distinguished between federal executives that were really successful in making a big strategy change and those that did not. And amongst the other things that we found, I found one piece fascinating, which was all of the leaders used performance measures. However, only the successful leaders, not all of them, but most, used measures of customer satisfaction and measures of quality. And so I found that kind of fascinating because it strikes me that, yeah, we're not in the government, we're not mostly in a kind of a basic research environment where we're trying to kind of do all sorts of research and hope that just kind of 1,000 flowers of innovation spring. Ideally, we're trying to innovate in ways that will benefit the particular agency, mission, and customer. And so that kind of the importance and the correlation, and it was a correlation, it wasn't causation, the correlation of using customer satisfaction metrics only occurring in agency leaders that were successful, that really struck me. And so I guess my question for you is, have you seen in your research and work any significant types of data or types of analytics that are more commonly associated with innovation? As you know, my hint is, I imagine, I don't know if it's true, but my hint is that perhaps customer analysis is more likely to result in successfully applied innovation. Do you find that to be true, or is there any other thing you find?
A couple perspectives, Jeff, and I think that's really a perceptive question. I believe that we have, well, by example, I'll start out with an example of urban planning, urban renewal. Okay, in that instance, the Great Society movement was to create economic prosperity for a large population within urban areas, the densest populations. And from a planning perspective, transportation became a key factor. So they basically pushed interstate highways into urban areas. Well, if there had been some consideration of the customer, if you will, the constituent, a customer experience view, for instance, a journey map associated with how people live within their communities, possibly some of the communities that were completely bifurcated or eliminated in this well-meaning intention to bring economic prosperity, they would have recognized that the families, the communities that had been together for generations in the same location would have had maybe a different view of economic prosperity in contrast. Data analytics associated by spatial data would also have given a demographic view and potentially been able to look at routing to the jobs that people have. Would potentially look at population changes in zoning over time that would have told a different story about the viability of those communities, and different policies may have been considered and implemented at a local level rather than thinking large-scale changes. So that's what came to mind when you asked the question. In terms of specific measures that are used, particularly from, again, the customer experience side, I would say that is true. It also opens up, when you think about risk in decision making, it exposes a lot of different sensitivities, if you will, related to past program performance, how we execute policy. So I'll give you another example. In the rural broadband initiative in this administration, they looked at beyond creating internet connectivity at like a house by house level along a rural route. We started looking at, rather than node drops, we started looking at productivity. And productivity is a measure of good public policy. And if we think about the farmer, rancher, producer who's 30 miles out of town, if they didn't have the kind of connectivity they needed to manage their operation, Internet of Things, adoption, participate in markets, be able to plan, in advance, without the internet connectivity, they were left sort of in an antiquated mode. But when we changed our equation about creating productivity rather than simply drops at a house so somebody can do their homework, which is really, really important, or get telemedicine, again, very important in rural areas. But we think about productivity, the metric changed, and it's go back to kind of what agenda are you trying to satisfy?
Great. So you've kind of been answering these questions, but I think there's just a real interest in some more specific applied examples from USDA. Let me combine two of them. Stuart Bolton asks, can you walk us through a simple example of applying your framework? And Shelley Metzenbaum asks, how have you been able to apply these insights at USDA? What results and lessons have you learned? And then there's another, Andrew Luckman says, do you have examples of analytics from Food and Nutrition Service? So it sounds like there's a really strong interest both in your work and what you've described, but also in kind of how it's been applied at USDA that you can offer, maybe you could offer one more example as opposed to the rural broadband one you just did,
Sure.
One more maybe.
Okay. The framework itself is really evolving for me. We are in the process, through the Office of the Chief Information Officer, launching an innovation lab. And it's been somewhat slow going because there's a lot of other priorities operational that have diverted resources appropriately to solving problems across the United States. Our technology supports a vast community of different stakeholders. However, we also recognize that to make better decisions about new and emerging technology, particularly, maybe new for us, maybe not new for industry, but new for us, how do we create an environment that allows people to understand those aspects of adoption, for instance, and value creation specifically? And so we've been able to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. In the previous administration, we created a platform called Know Your Food, Know Your Farmer, And what that involved was using technology innovatively to connect local and regional food systems being producers, farm to table, local sourcing for restaurants, for instance, by identifying the programming that resulted in project funds for specific kinds of participants in this network community, and visualizing it in a way that people could actually take action, take initiative where they live, to connect with people who had funds and start to leverage funds, to be able to use that to create more creative capital for expanding different kinds of solutions. And that was an innovation effort that was very much like traditionally like a skunk works, that led to my understanding of innovation as an important aspect of analytics. Now, we have a very, very mature capability around looking at the vast data that we have, applying a method. We use a particular platform called Tableau at USDA, and getting to insights for operational decision making. But to my earlier comment, I think we're now kind of coming back and saying, well, what are the appropriate questions to ask? What are these events that are really pivotal in how we provide different kinds of services? And we're learning about that, I think, as time goes on. In terms of food and nutrition service, I think that's a huge component of USDA. It's like half of our budget practically. It's very rough, but food support, food safety is part of USDA's mission. Yet the states are the execution agents of this particular program. So what we have to do is learn how to share data back and forth so that we right-size policies in a way locally that allow them to create the greatest benefit for the constituent.
Let me ask one more of my own questions. I perceive that several of the major business growth opportunities that have taken place using technology, let's just say Uber, for example, and Amazon, have been typically finding kind of very specific demand, unique demand, a person standing on a street corner at the corner of 10th and Q streets, and then matching it up with supply in a way that doesn't just happen at random. The taxi doesn't just drive by. In fact, the technology matches the demand with the supply and creates an enormous market. Uber's a pretty big company, and it makes me kind of wonder, similarly, a key decision for a farmer might be, what crop should I grow this year? How much of it should I grow? And what's the price going to be? And so I can decide whether or not to make a big investment or not. And so my question is whether or not USDA is undertaking any similar sort of innovation to match uncertain and kind of opaque information about demand with information to potentially a supplier who might be an individual farmer. Is that an area where USDA has been innovating that you could remark on as an example?
I believe we have, very much so. Our partnerships, for instance, with different industry providers within looking at agriculture supply chain generally. You have your, John Deere's the world, for instance, and there's all this precision agriculture that's available now and very mature for farmers. How you make that accessible for smaller operations, and there's a huge population of small to medium-sized farms that can't quite get to this technology. So how do you simplify? So we look at, for instance, partnerships with Microsoft and TV Whitespace as a way to create accessibility for broadband on a local basis. It's basically an antenna. It's very simple. It has a great deal of capacity for a farm operation, small, medium-sized farm operation. It's being tested now, for instance. It also has proven itself in different kinds of terrain, different kinds of geographies, which is important because the United States isn't just one flat plane. It's a variety of different mixed geographies. So how do you get a technology that's low cost, accessible, maturing, and then how do you encourage industry standardization and kind of assemblages, different kinds of plug and play kind of options, depending on the type of operation an individual has, whether it's shiitake mushrooms in the middle of West Virginia or growing hemp in Southwest Virginia.
Great. Participant Checo Yumino had two questions. One is, can we will we get the slides? Another participant asked whether or not we can go back to the references. The slides are actually going to be distributed within the next 48 hours in a thank you note and attached, so everybody will get them. Checo also had a question. Stephen, can you elaborate on the governance innovation framework slide? What's the significance to add human-centered design in the framework?
Right. So this work, I'll say first of all, this work is really mature and ongoing. The Office of Personnel Management, the lab, has really led the way in the federal government in this space, and they've looked at the Carnegie Mellon model for human-centered design, design engineering school creation through Maya. They evolved that into their own set of capabilities. What I see human-centered design providing, and we demonstrated this in the Center of Excellence work that USDA led in the past few years, and demonstrated its value, is creating, for instance, journey maps as a way to understand the producers, farmer, ranchers, their movement through a particular process, so that we don't think about delivery of public programs as kind of bureaucratic, kind of isolated sort of events, but we think about holistically the experience someone has of interacting with our agency, and how can we improve that? How can they participate in that process itself so it becomes better over time rather than they have to adapt and learn to it? And potentially having USDA programs focus on the orientation of a particular customer profile rather than each single program producing their own applications, their own kind of processes to satisfy their particular mandates. Human-centered design has a variety of different important attributes. I think the contextualization is probably the strongest component of that. I know when we when we designed the crowdsourcing and citizen science environment with OSTP, that idea of contextualization was really, really important. So we had web designers and content designers working together to create basically a way of linking different ideas that would build on each other. So I want to start, I'm a government employee, and I want to crowdsource a particular idea before I build, even before solicitation. I want to crowdsource an idea to those people that would consume it, again, where they are locally. And this this idea of human-centered design allowed us to capture that, embedded in the actual design of different kinds of solicitations of projects, or even adjust or right-size existing programs in a way that led to better execution, better consumption metrics associated with it, and ongoing participation of the constituents.
Great. I actually would add, REI has made a real focus of human-centered design in the last 2 years, and there are three pretty basic reasons. One is because it helps reduce the cost of the use of a system, and that maybe it can make it more efficient for the government employees who are using it, but it also can reduce the amount of time that a customer, perhaps a farmer or an immigrant, might need to spend with the system. And so that reduction of cost both reduces cost to the government or allows it to increase the number of folks it can serve with the same staffing. It also reduces the burden of the customers, so they are more likely to use it. And eventually, from kind of a system developer and manager perspective, both REI as well as our customers, systems that aren't accepted by users generally get abandoned and they're a waste of money. And the government doesn't come back and ask us to help them again if we have that happen. And fortunately, that has not happened to us, but that's something where just the people's ability to find the system user-friendly, intuitive, and to make use of it means they use it, and otherwise they don't. So human-centered design, I think, is just going to grow in increasing importance, and it's not just actually about the technology and the user interface. It's about the kind of the overall process of, must I really take 15 different steps to accomplish this thing? Well, if there are 15 steps on paper, if there are 15 steps on the computer, it doesn't make much difference. If you can get the computer instead to help, take 10 of the steps automatically, and the user now only has to take 5 steps, and those are the 5 that really require human judgment, then you've kind of designed the process with a human-centric focus in addition to the technology.
I think that's a major. You make a great point, Jeff, and your experience with your customers, kind of proves this, that you can increase time to market with solutions, public solutions, at a lower cost, simply because you're looking at a prototype at a 60 or 70% precision. You aren't trying to create a 100% solution, but you're validating the solution with those who are going to benefit most from it. And that does result in savings from a variety. I would also say it helps in terms of transaction costs. And what I mean by that is it helps us discover where the friction is in the system for people searching for different kinds of information, because they're interacting with the solution itself. So we can now better cultivate and curate the content that we create, so that we don't have these massive data stores that nobody can do anything with.
Yeah. Let's see, Matisha Montgomery asks, can you walk through the 6 individual roles and discuss where these roles sit in the organization, how they can best collaborate, and whether some people can or should serve in multiple roles? And again, I think it might be most useful to people if you can do that in kind of the context of your real experience at USDA, perhaps. Sure.
Well, again, if I use the Center of Excellence initiative, we deliberately had used an ethnographic approach to put together a coherent story and narrative about the customer experience. I think this has to be built into, and if you will, almost a performance work statement element for the creation of different, particularly technological solutions, but I would even argue policy programming kinds of solutions. If you don't ask the question, you won't know. So deliberately placing these individuals upstream in a deliverable process, so that when this particular solution, as it's evolving, comes to the analysts, the people who are trying to kind of quantify the performance that is necessary for the solution, that it can be a more robust, more valid, more relevant capability. I think there can be, to the other part of the question, I think people can occupy multiple roles. I would suggest that this represents maybe some reskilling and career trajectories. And what's unclear is kind of where these positions, these roles reside. Should they reside in an IT organization? Should they reside in a policy organization? And I'd say we have a ways to go in terms of our executive office policy shops in being able to kind of comprehend these different different roles. And so I think there's a great deal of opportunity. I think we conduct curation now, but I don't know if we do it in a particularly deliberate way. And therefore, we have millions of web pages and really don't have a good way of orchestrating that environment.
If I might inject on that, I'm an oddball in my company. Almost all of us are technologists, except me. I really don't know anything about technology. But I kind of play the author role. And what I find is very important, both in my company and I think, frankly, in a lot of federal agencies, is that the agencies tend to think about what information do we have? Let's push that information out and share it because it's valuable. And my job is instead to kind of reverse that and say, who's the audience that we're trying to communicate with? What information do they need? And let's actually push out the information that people need amongst our audience, not every bit of information we have. And just kind of taking the opposite chair across that conversation table between kind of agency and customer helps to think about, we may have 10 terabytes of information, but perhaps the customer doesn't need 9 of them. Maybe the customer needs 1 of them, and let's get it to them in the right time, in the right format, and in a way that the customer in this particular case will understand. Which, of course, if you segment your customers, might be different for a small rural farmer versus a large corporate kind of producer of a single crop. So that's something I think I love your framework and thinking about the different roles. I find myself fitting primarily in one of them. Let me ask Jen Bachner if you're available to join. I do want to ask one last thing of the entire audience, which I asked to begin with, which is we would love for members of the audience to suggest future speakers. And in particular, I offered a couple of ideas. One topic might be how to get people to actually pay attention, whether those people are Congress or whether they're senior executives or whether they're frontline staff. How do you get them to pay attention to analytics? And if you've got a suggestion for an agency or a person who's really gotten a really big improvement from before and after an initiative, we'd love to find that person and have them come and share that experience with us. And another is perhaps around predictive analytics and predicting the track and path of COVID. If you have a suggestion as to someone who's been really successful at that and can come and talk about how they've done predictive analytics, again, I think that might be really interesting to this audience across government. But with that, let me turn it back to Jen.
I agree with Jeff's ideas for future speakers. Would love your suggestions. I want to say thank you to our current speaker for offering a set of what I think are really valuable insights about how innovation in government informs analytics. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining, and please stay tuned to your inboxes for information about our next event. And I know several of our audience members were interested in the slides and the presentation, so we will be sharing that with you and certainly encourage you to share those with your colleagues and continue the conversation.
Now, one last thing that Mr. Costello kindly offered, which is that although we've committed to finishing the event by 10, he says he's available and can spend a few more minutes. So if there are folks who are attending and didn't get your question answered, we can just unmute folks and you can have a direct conversation with Mr. Costello as long as he's available. There's no reason we actually have to end at 10 other than having promised not to constrict your schedules. So thank you very much, Mr. Costello. And at this stage, if you want, you're welcome to raise your hand or you're welcome to pose another question in the chat box, and we can continue to the extent you all are interested. Let's see, I see Tim Kearley has asked a question. I don't know if he's still on the line. It looks like he is. He says, I've seen customer surveys that reflect a gradual migration toward wanting usable data now versus needing to know the data are of the highest quality. What government innovation strategies can reduce time to market and foster trust? We have to do both now.
Well, there's a lot packed in there. Could you read the question one more time, please?
Sure, and I've just unmuted Tim. Tim, would you, if you're able to, would you like to rephrase your question, or shall I read it again?
Well, I I can. I just, it's, you know, it did, we've kind of, as things have sped up, as I was mentioning, you know, everybody used to say, I just need to know what's right. And now it's become, I just need it now. And if Google has it now, that's what I'm going to work with, because I need to, you know, respond to these things at the speed of the questions coming. And it's just been a big challenge. I appreciate a lot of these methods of more thoughtfully examining the problem, but I am looking for ways to get the data out. And I think that the point about not trying to release everything, focusing on the things, starting early and saying, what can we get out? Because it has to get out sooner. But it can't, it has to be of quality too. And those things haven't always gone together, but they have to, or else we lose our seat at the microphone.
Yeah, that's great. And powerful, convening power of the government is huge, Tim, and you're experiencing that firsthand immediately. I think the opportunity resides in, if you will, putting a governor on the channels themselves. So as content is flowing both ways, understanding how the consumer is categorizing, classifying relative to the problem set they want to work with. Is it diagnosis, planning? What kind of problem set are they working with? And helping them articulate that. But it's also been, what's the government response? What's the specialist response to the ambiguity, the gaps that exist, right? What would be great is if we could focus on helping the consumer kind of create the appropriate demand around generic content and allow the specialists in the government, which there are fewer of us, to focus on the more custom and boutique and maybe exploratory kinds of issues, right? So how do you set up an environment that does that? And I think the technology exists, but I don't know if we've actually framed the problem that way.
One of the things I think in response to that I've seen, I think works pretty well is it's bluntly just communication. For example, the SAM.gov, System for Award Management, that GSA uses to help manage interactions contractually with government, for about 1.5 years now, they've called it beta.sam.gov, which kind of tells people pretty clearly, hey, it's not perfect, it's under development and improving, good enough to try, but we're looking for feedback. And it just kind of manages expectations. And maybe that similar sort of kind of, let's just label things in a way that manages expectations that we're not going to be perfect the first time. And eventually, and for some purposes, we need to get perfect data. So let's maybe have that be a subset or a kind of a later iteration. I've noticed that Shelley.
I can jump on, Jeff, real quickly. I think as well, visualizing this for everyone participating in the community. How do you show when particular types of content mature and gain a more robust, kind of more holistic accuracy for that particular community? And I think it's incumbent upon the government to show that kind of growth in the value of that content as a result of its use.
Let me suggest, Shelley Metzenbaum had a question. She's actually, I believe, a colleague of yours, Stephen, from OMB. I've unmuted you, or tried to, Shelley. You may be able to unmute yourself if you would like to ask your question. Shelley, I'm not hearing you. Okay, so let me then read Shelley's question, because I think she's still participating. Her question is, oh, okay, great, Shelley.
Hi, Stephen.
Hey,
this was such a very rich conversation. One of the questions I'm trying to think about is, are there good platforms? Shouldn't the federal government, in a sense, create platforms for not only conversation, but decision-making and action to help at the local level? And my sense from some of the examples you gave was that you were starting to get that there. But I wondered if you agree that this is something the federal government could and should do. And secondly, if so, are there any good examples out there and that we can build on?
Well, I think it depends in a sense on the mission, right? If I'm HHS, if I'm agriculture as a primary mission to communities, rural communities, then I have different resources in the form of agents We have extension agents, for instance, that are connected to land grant universities, right? And those individuals literally have conversations with farmers, producers, researchers at the university, and become kind of a transmitted and sensor for what's happening in these communities themselves. So first of all, do you have a way of kind of capturing of that kind of local event? I call them small events. And, you know, maybe we haven't thought about that before. Maybe there are people that have a huge touch on. And you know what's fascinating to me is most often those people are the ones most frustrated with bureaucracy, because they're trying to serve constituents, but they can't because of these old, antiquated, rigorous systems that don't take account of what's happening at a local level, yet they're the very ones that have eyes on the prize.
Well, I mean, so part of this, and the two of you are talking about this more than most people I know that I'm thinking about, is like the 900 billion almost in grants. It's probably over that now with COVID, right? And what's the role of the federal grant making agency? And shouldn't it be trying to help these grantees learn from each other's experience, learn from the research that's out there, and then support local decision making? And then, as you say, make it iterative. So how do we use new technologies to create sort of online platforms that support that and encourage that? That's just a thought.
Yeah, and I think there's some good work, for instance, over at GSA, where they've stood up the transformational technology services and the policy group that Dan Pomeroy is working through. How do we modify and sort out policy? For instance, OMB directives, how do we revise those so that we incentivize and reward creativity and innovation that leads to those kinds of outcomes we desire? You know, if we continue to reward the old system approach, then we're never going to get where we need to go. So I think, for instance, that's an example of how government has started to reconstruct and formulate itself to achieve the kinds of goals that we keep espousing and aspirations.
I wonder, Stephen, and this question may be difficult to answer, but in the pharmaceutical industry, they may spend a benchmark of 20% of revenue on innovation and research. Technology, especially small companies, it tends to be even higher than that. And so my question is kind of, is there a benchmark you think federal agencies ought to be dedicating to either innovation in terms of their spend, or even a tougher question, how much of their spend should they dedicate towards analytics? How much is enough? You know, is it possible to say on a blanket basis, you know, agencies X, Y, and Z spend too little, agencies A, B, and C spend the right amount or too much? Yeah,
well, I think I'm not sure of the exact percentage. I've heard anywhere from like 5 to 12%. I think maybe the where you want to start at is how big is the implosion if you get it wrong? What's it cost you if you get it wrong? So that, you know, that's the important front end question. And I would say you put a time box and a constraint on innovation, as well as create it as a gate for then moving to the next stages of platform development, for instance, right? Whatever technology and processes and skill bases that you're trying to bring in bear on a public problem. But I think you need to do that upstream. I think you need to apply a percentage that's associated with the magnitude of the problem itself realistically. And you know, we have the money for this. I mean, if you know, just the old adage, right? If you don't get requirements right on the front end, it's going to cost you 50 to 200% on the downstream side. Just, you know, classic technology calculations, and I'd say that's probably, you know, right. So yeah, that's how I'd answer it.
Okay. If anyone has any last questions, I think we've gotten through all the ones that were typed in. I am trying to unmute each of you who, although you may be self-muted, is there anyone else who would like to ask a question before we close out? All right. Well, I would like to thank you very much again, Stephen. It's really been a pleasure hearing from you and sharing your ideas. They're very well structured and very thorough, so we really appreciate it. And same offer to you as I made to the entirety of our audience, which is if you can suggest future speakers that you think would be of strong interest to the cross-government community, we would love to have your suggestions. But thanks again so much for your time and taking the taking the effort to participate in the community.
I've enjoyed it, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you, Jen, Ashley, for helping facilitate and helping me present the content. I look forward to an ongoing discussion around, these are ideas, and ideas are meant to mature and evolve over time. So I wish you all just a really safe and blessed holiday season as you go forward.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.